Thank you very much for that. I think I've just discovered a new definition of politeness. It's to be introduced by a German on the eve of the FA Cup, the World Cup semi-final, who doesn't even mention it. So that was kind. That was kind. I'd even worked out that he probably would, and I would then divulge that ich bin Schotter, and therefore I'm probably as happy as you are at what has recently happened. I'm not really. No. Anyway, it's nice to be here, and it's always nice to be introduced and for the person to tell you what you're going to say. I'll now tailor my comments to suit. And I think it is important that I first of all just set the context in a sense. I mean, I'm the guy who was in charge of Tony Blair's press relations and ended up having the worst press relations of anybody in Britain. I was somewhere between asylum seekers and mass murderers on the kind of, you know, the Daily Mail lectern of hate. But I think it's that in itself is not a bad way to get into the point of what I want to say today, which is that, as you say, in my mind, strategic communications is the only communications that counts and the only communications that works. Now, some of you probably know the Arthur W. Page Society, which is a communications networking group. And they did a report not long ago called The Authentic Enterprise, which I think was interesting and unflinching in its analysis of the gale of change that's sweeping through your industry. The main message, as I read it, was that three major forces, the empowerment of new stakeholders, the digital network revolution, and the reality of globalization have converged to produce an inflection point, a game-changing moment when economic, social, and technological forces combine to change the world forever. And I think that whether we might argue about the scale of change, nobody can argue, really, that we don't live in a world that is defined now by the pace of change. And what their report concluded, and this is a phrase that is both true and, I think, chilling, if, like me, you are a control freak, when they said, broadly, we, the communicators, are not in control. Now, I think that applies to the bosses of big financial institutions. They feel the same because they feel less in control of their own organizations than they did. I think that it applies to consumers who are worried about the recession, foreclosed mortgages, loss of jobs, insecurity. And it certainly applies to politicians who are often trying to set an agenda but find that events outside too often set it for them. And it was interestingly, not long ago, Kevin Rudd, the then Australian Prime Minister, he made a very interesting observation. He said that he thought the economic crisis was, in a sense, the economic equivalent of September the 11th. Now, it's interesting that he said it at a time when he was riding high, and just a few months later, he's now gone. Gone as Prime Minister, all sorts of political, economic, cultural forces at work, and he was unable to control them. But I think that we do have to understand the scale of change that is happening all around us before we try to address what the job of communicators is in trying to understand it and then deal with it. Now, I think beneath it, there have been a number of very significant factors that have just been sort of bubbling away, and they've all, in a sense, come to a head at the same time. The first is what I call the merger of citizen and consumer. I exaggerate to make the point, but there used to be a pretty clear divide. You had public sector values and you had private sector standards. And citizens now expect from government the same sort of service that they expect from the private sector when they're paying a pretty good price for it. And likewise, and I think we're seeing this in the financial crisis and its response to it, they expect from private sector companies the best of the values that they associate with a successful public sector. And I think that's a very, very big change that is having an impact both upon the public sector and the private sector in a way that a lot on both sides have not really thought through. The second big change, I think, is what I call the rise of the democratic corporation. if 10, 20 years ago, if we talked about the stakeholders affecting any sector, you kind of knew what you meant. You'd have a regulatory framework that was fairly clear and understood. You'd have shareholders, you'd have investors, you'd have a cycle of meetings that would see you through the calendar. And I think the big change in this has been the advent of the web and the internet, and because what it means is that any organisation or any individual that has any contact with a brand or another organisation feels that they have a stake, ultimately can have a stake, can have an impact upon how that organisation is seen and how it operates and whether it's successful or not. And I think that's been a big change, which again, I think a lot of organisations have not really responded to terribly well. The third big change is in the emergence of a very different, much more participatory, much more aggressive, much more judgmental media. Now, I know I'm British and I speak from the British perspective, and maybe our media exaggerates all those points. But actually, the trend in media around most democracies, I think, is going in the same direction. And it is totally, completely transformed from what it was. You mentioned that I started out in newspapers. I started out as a journalist 30 years ago. I mean, back then, if you said the media, most conversations now, at some point, the media will be in there somewhere. Back then, the media was the paper that you took every day. It was the news that you watched or listened to probably once a day for 10 minutes. It used to be an event. You say to your family, shall we go and watch the news? And you go and sit in front of a TV and you watch the news, and then you go back to what you were doing before. And then you might get a golf magazine or a football magazine or a knitting magazine, and that was your media consumption. Now, the media is all around us all the time. And that has forced the media to change. Because there's no point in complaining about it, it's developed in such a way that they become much, much more competitive. I think it's taken most of the media in most countries substantially down market. It's made, there's more space than ever for debate, but actually there's less debate because they tend to centre around one or two stories, one or two issues at a time, and that's the biggest thing going on, and then they move on to the next thing. And there's no point in complaining about it. You've just got to kind of adapt to it, and you've got to respond to it. And of course, back to the internet, the other big thing, that's the other big change. Last time I saw the NEB counting, 128 million blogs in existence, 175,000 new blogs starting every day. Now, most of them will be read by the author and the author's parents and a few friends and the rest of it. Some of them will suddenly connect and become part of a new and different media landscape. They'll become as important in their own way as newspapers. And that, again, is changing the way that you have to respond to that changed landscape.